Game warden found a missing hiker's final photos. The man who took them is hunting him now. In the first week of June, deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, inside the Dolly Sods wilderness of the Monongahela National Forest, a solo game warden was dispatched on what should have been a routine poaching call. What he found strapped to a hemlock at the edge of the footpath didn't just break the case open. It turned him from the hunter into the hunted. By the time state police pulled the file, one hiker was confirmed dead. The warden's own home had been entered without a single broken lock, and investigators would spend months trying to explain how a man could be watched for weeks without ever knowing it. What you are about to hear is the account. His name is Royce Calloway, and this happened to him. Royce heard the clicking before he saw the tree, and it was already wrong. He'd been walking off trail for 20 minutes, following a hotline tip about root diggers working the ginseng research plots along Red Creek. A call that had come in flagged under his own badge number instead of a case number, a mix-up the dispatcher never caught and Royce never questioned. Just another Thursday in a district he'd asked to run alone. 11 years in, 4 of them covering 17,000 roped-off acres by himself, since the state cut the funding for a second warden. A posting he'd requested himself, chasing quiet. He carried a 9-year-old radio that only picked up signal on the ridgeline, a GPS cracked from a fall 2 winters back, and a citation book he hadn't opened since March. The drainage had its usual sound going, wind combing through red spruce, a woodcock winnowing somewhere low. But underneath it ran something rhythmic, mechanical almost, ticking in a pattern no bird or insect on this mountain had ever made. He clocked it and kept walking, because that's what 11 years teaches you to do with a sound you can't place yet. He passed a hemlock and barely registered the 5 faint notches gouged into the bark at eye level, the kind of marks 100 trees on this ridge carried from buck rubs. He didn't stop for it. He wouldn't think about it again for 3 more days, and by then it would be the least strange thing about that tree. The clicking led him straight to a trail camera, strapped high on the same trunk, half swallowed by new bark growth like the tree had been growing around it for a while. The tip had said, "Root diggers." Root diggers didn't climb. He pulled it loose and thumbed the housing open. The memory light blinked once, green, meaning the battery had been swapped recently, and the harder question was how recently actually was. He bagged the card without powering the unit on, the way you do when a job stops feeling like the job you were sent to do. What he missed was the second card, wedged flat behind the first, pressed so tight against the bark it read as texture instead of object. He wouldn't find it for 3 more days. He wouldn't understand what was on it for longer than that. He started back down the grid the way he'd come, telling himself the badge number mix-up was clerical, the clicking was equipment, the notches were nothing. Somewhere behind him, the sound that had led him to the tree in the first place had already stopped, and he never once turned around to notice when. The card reader was the same $9 one he'd bought at the Petersburg Walmart 2 summers back, the housing cracked along one seam from a drop in his truck bed. It smelled faintly of cold aluminum when he pulled it from the truck console, and under that something fainter, wet rot, off the water-damaged plastic of the camera housing itself, like the unit had spent longer in that hollow than the bark growth alone accounted for. He plugged it in that night at his kitchen table, expecting maybe 100 photos. Deer, a bear working the research plots, something that would explain a tip about root diggers. There were over 4,000, all of him. He scrolled fast at first, then slower, then not at all, because the earliest file on the card was dated 5 months before he'd even filed the transfer paperwork to run that district alone. Someone had aimed a lens at ground he hadn't claimed yet. He talked himself down from it the way you do at 11:30 at night with the porch light the only thing on. Recycled card. Previous warden's gear. Reissued without anybody wiping it. It happened. Equipment got passed around a cash-strapped district all the time. Then he scrolled to the last file. Time-stamped that morning. 7:41. Him, mid-step, one hand already closing around the camera housing. The exact motion, the exact second, of him stealing the very card he was now looking at. No previous owner theory survived a photograph of its own theft, taken from the inside. His phone rang before he could sit with that long enough to be afraid of it. Ashworth, his captain, voice already moving fast, the way it did when the news was bad and he wanted it over with. A body had turned up that afternoon in the Red Creek drainage. A hiker, missing 3 weeks, a man named Emery Truex who'd told his sister he was doing 4 days solo and never checked back in. Royce's district. Royce's grid, the only warden who'd walked that ground all season, which meant the lead on a death investigation now sat inside the exact footprint of whoever had been photographing him for half a year. Ashworth kept talking. The county could hold local jurisdiction for 48 hours before the case automatically reverted to a joint task force out of Charleston. After that, Royce wouldn't run point on anything. He'd just be a name in somebody else's file. 48 hours to walk the grid, log it clean, and make the case defensible before it left his hands for good. Royce thought about his son, Wyatt, asleep down the hall, and about how a task force from Charleston wouldn't know which trail cameras belonged to the district and which ones didn't. Royce didn't mention the camera. Didn't mention the card sitting open on his kitchen table with his own face staring back at him from 5 months before he'd asked for this posting. He told himself he'd bring it up once he'd looked at it properly, a decision that would matter more than he understood in that moment. Ashworth added one more thing, almost as an afterthought, the kind of detail that gets buried at the end of a call because the person saying it doesn't yet know it's important. Truex had kept a field journal. Evidence intake had it now, pending release back to the family. Royce barely registered the sentence. He was still looking at the timestamp. He hung up and sat in the quiet kitchen a while, the laptop fan warm against his wrist. Outside, his truck's scanner, left on out of habit, mounted low on the dash, cut through 3 clean seconds of a voice reading digits before dissolving into static. Digits that matched his own badge number, the same one misfiled on that morning's tip. He told himself it was crosstalk bleeding through from a county 3 ridges over, and switched it off before a 4th second could come. Royce didn't sleep well that night. He wouldn't understand why until 3 days later, standing in front of his own porch camera, looking at a photograph nobody should have been able to take. Royce mounted the second camera on his own porch 2 days later, wanting proof on his own terms this time, a small, cheap unit zip-tied to the rail post, aimed dead at his front door. He wanted something he could point to, something that couldn't be explained away over a phone call. By morning, it had turned to face him from a completely different angle. Not knocked loose, not sagging on a loosened strap. The mount had been re-leveled, the screws reset flush against the post, the housing rotated a clean 180 degrees, so it now pointed through his own front window instead of down the drive. He ran his thumb along the mounting wire out of habit, checking the tension, and the rusted spiral of it left a thin orange smear across his skin. The same wire he'd wound on himself 2 days earlier, now recoiled tighter than he remembered leaving it. Whoever had done it hadn't rushed. A person in a hurry doesn't stop to re-level a camera mount. One new photo sat on the card. Royce, asleep in his own bed, taken from an angle only possible if someone had been standing inside his living room. No trigger event logged, no motion alert. Just the photo sitting there, dated that night. He stood on the porch a long while working out how a man gets that close to a house with a dog 3 cabins down that barked at raccoons and comes up with nothing that held together. His phone rang before he'd finished the thought. Dr. Kessler from the state medical examiner's office, talking fast and clinical, the vocabulary of someone used to delivering hard news in a straight line. Truex's injuries showed restraint, not accident. Ligature marks on both wrists, positioned like someone had been held in place, not attacked in passing. Homicide. Royce wrote the word on his notepad and looked at it longer than a single word deserved. Ashworth called an hour after that, unaware of the sleeping photo, pushing Royce to hand the whole file over to state police early. Get ahead of the 48-hour clock instead of racing it. Royce said no, said he was close. Didn't mention the camera, the rotation, the photograph of himself with his eyes closed. He told himself bringing it up would get him pulled off the one thing keeping him near any answers at all, a decision that would cost him more than he understood in that moment. That evening, Evidence Intake released Truex's field journal, and Royce read it at his kitchen table with the porch light on and the blinds shut for the first time since he'd moved in. The early entries were ordinary. Mileage, weather, a joke about his knees. Then, around day 7, Truex stopped signing his name at the bottom of each entry, like the habit had stopped mattering to him. The handwriting got smaller, tighter. By day 9, he was writing in fragments. The last legible line wasn't dated like the others. It was numbered. Day 11. Stopped thinking of it as tracking. Tracking means it wants to catch you. This isn't that. This is filing. Royce read it twice. It didn't read like a man losing his grip out there alone. It read like someone taking careful clinical notes on exactly how much time he had left, and disagreeing, flatly, with every theory Royce had been quietly building for himself all week. Outside, fog had rolled into the hollow with no front behind it to explain it, thick enough to swallow the tree line, checked twice against a forecast that had promised clear skies through the weekend. His front door needed an extra shove to close that night, the wood swollen tight in a stretch of weather that had been bone dry for 11 straight days. The 5 notches on the hemlock came up once more that week, in an offhand line from Ashworth about an old, unsolved missing persons cluster tied to that exact grid, going back further than either of them had bothered to check. Neither of them thought, in that moment, to sit down and count how many names the old cluster actually had. Ashworth told him not to go back out there alone. Royce went anyway, right at dusk, carrying a gas can and a lighter and nothing else. No backup, no radio check-in scheduled, just a decision he'd made somewhere between the journal entry and that morning's coffee. If whoever was running this wanted contact, Royce was going to force it on his own terms, at the one spot he knew they'd already been. The drainage didn't want him back. Fog rolled in off the ridge with no front behind it to explain the timing, thick enough that his headlamp beam just bounced light back at his own face. The temperature dropped hard for June, fast enough that his breath started showing, fast enough that his hands went stiff around the gas can's handle. His GPS looped the same dead-straight half-mile of trail twice, the arrow spinning where the line should have run clean, and both times he checked the satellite count, and both times it read full bars. He kept walking anyway, because turning back now meant admitting the woods had already won something. He found the hemlock by feel more than sight, doused the camera mount in gasoline and struck the lighter, and the bark caught fast, dry enough underneath to burn hot and quick. The flame threw light in every direction, orange and moving, and for exactly as long as he stood there watching it, the trail behind him disappeared into the one blind spot the fire created. 30 seconds, maybe less. By the time he turned back toward his truck, smoke-blind and coughing, lungs burning from the gasoline fumes, his porch counter camera was already gone from where he'd left it that morning. He found it zip-tied to his own tailgate. Brand new tie. Square-cut ends, the kind that don't come from any roll in his own kit. He checked his glove box spool to be sure, and the ends there were rounded, cut a different way entirely. His hands weren't steady enough to read the display the first time, so he checked it again. Wyatt, at a Saturday soccer game 3 days ago. A game Royce had never attended. A game nobody had ever photographed. He stood at his own open tailgate a long moment, doing math that refused to add up. 40 miles between here and that field, full daylight, dozens of parents standing around, and not one of them would ever remember a stranger with a camera. Whoever this was didn't need darkness, didn't need to hide. Walking back to the fire to knock it down before it spread, he saw it. The bark under the smoldering mount hadn't burned evenly, and where it had peeled away clean, a 6th notch sat exposed beneath the char. Fresh, sharp-edged, nothing like the 5 weathered ones beside it. He counted them twice. 5 old, 1 new. The counting didn't answer anything because the number was never the part that mattered. What mattered was that the 6th cut looked recent, deliberate, made by someone who'd already decided how this ended before it happened. That was when he remembered the 2nd card, the one wedged behind the 1st, back on day 1, that he'd never pulled and never looked at. He dug it out of his kit with hands still shaking from adrenaline and cold, forced it into the cracked reader, and thumbed through on a screen barely holding a signal. Truex, alive, photographed from inside his own tent, from an angle that put the camera inside the campsite with him, taken days before anyone reported him missing, weeks before he became a body in the Red Creek drainage. The watcher didn't just find its victims after, it logged them first. Royce didn't run. He keyed his radio with fingers that wouldn't fully cooperate and called it in as physical evidence, requested backup to the ranger station, gave dispatch his location twice because his voice kept breaking up worse than the signal. The drive out hit every sense at once. Engine noise too loud in the cab, the old truck's transmission whining on the grade, smoke still clinging to his jacket and hair, thick enough to taste at the back of his throat with every breath. The salt of cold sweat running into the corner of his mouth, mixing with the bitter aftertaste of gasoline he hadn't managed to wash off his hands. His headlights swept the closure gate road right as something crossed it low and fast, there and then gone, before his foot ever found the brake, before his mind could sort shape from shadow, from the last of the drifting fog. He never got a clean look at it. He'd spend the rest of that year wishing he had, and being grateful in the same breath that he hadn't. The case got reclassified within the week. Homicide, unsolved, folded into a joint state-county task force out of Charleston the moment the 48 hours ran out, which should have felt like losing it. Instead, Royce got kept on as the local liaison, the only warden who knew the grid well enough to walk investigators through it. He couldn't rotate off the district now even if he'd wanted to. The reassignment read like a demotion on paper. It functioned like a leash. Weeks passed. No arrests. No name attached to any of it beyond a working theory the task force wouldn't put in writing yet. Then, on a Tuesday in late July, a plain envelope showed up in the intake slot at the ranger station. No postmark, no return address. Not dropped through the slot the way mail usually was, wedged into the frame of it, corner first. The same deliberate placement as a second SD card he'd once found, pressed flat behind a first one, back before any of this had a name. Inside was one photograph. Royce at his own desk, filing the incident report on this exact case, dated the day before. He sat with it a long time before he showed it to anyone, running his thumb along the same edge where the envelope had been wedged, feeling for a seam that wasn't there. The first photograph anyone had ever shown him in this whole mess had caught him mid-step on a trail, pocketing a memory card he didn't yet know was watching him back. This one caught him at a desk, inside a locked building, doing paperwork meant to close the case. Different rooms, different months, same shape exactly. Except now there was nothing left to explain it away with. No recycled card, no previous owner. Just confirmation that whatever this was hadn't stopped and had never needed him to be outside a building to reach him. He started catching himself, in the weeks after, listening for it. That same non-repeating clicking pattern, the one that had led him to a hemlock back in June, surfacing in rooms where it had no business existing. The break room, his truck cab at idle, his own kitchen at midnight. One afternoon at the station, the old cast-iron radiator against the far wall clicked 3 times as it cooled, the way old radiators do when the pipes contract. Except each click landed a fraction of a second off from the last, uneven in a way 3 clicks from the same cooling metal shouldn't be. Not random, exactly. Patterned, the way the clicking in the drainage had been patterned, back before he'd known to be afraid of it. He counted them on his fingers without meaning to, the same way he'd once counted 5 notches, then 6. Then he went back to his paperwork, because that was the only part of any of this he still had any control over. Hikers go missing in national forests every year, hundreds of them, some found within days, some never found at all, their files quietly aging in drawers in county offices across a dozen states. The strange part was never that Emery Truex disappeared. Cases like his happen more than most people want to know. The part nobody could explain, the part that stayed with Royce longer than anything else, was the 6th notch, cut clean into that hemlock bark, before he'd ever set foot in that district, before Truex had ever laced up his boots for that hike. Somebody had already known exactly how this would end. Royce still doesn't know who.